Welcome back to another edition of the True Crime Show, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Now on today's show, I'm joined with Stephen and Joyce Singler to discuss their book, Unholy Messenger, The Life and Crimes of the BTK Serial Killer. Now, over the years, Joyce has attended legal proceedings, visited inmates in prison, and interviewed witnesses. She's also the co-author of numerous true crime books, along with her husband, Stephen Singler. Now, Stephen has published over 25 non-fiction books, many of them about high-profile criminal cases. He's also written sports and business biographies and social commentary. So on today's show, we're going to discuss the serial killer, Dennis Rader, aka the BTK serial killer. Now, BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill. Steve and Joyce Singler, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us,
Yes,
Kevin.
thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you both on. You've done some amazing books, and just today we're just going to sort of home in on the BTK book that you've done. But to begin with, just give us a bit of background individually on, how you got into this kind of field, and just a bit of information on, anything you want to tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm from rural Kansas, which is actually relevant to the story that we're going to be talking about. I grew up in a very small town in Kansas, and in my 20s I worked in New York and as a freelance magazine writer, moved to Denver in the 80s, and wrote my first book that came out in 1987 about the assassination of a talk show host here in Denver. The book was called Talk to Death, and Oliver Stone made a movie more or less based upon the book called Talk Radio that came out in 1989. I sort of fell into crime writing by doing that. It was something I really enjoyed. And when I was working on my third book, I believe, I met Joyce. And ever since then, she's been helping me, and we've been sort of partners in crime writing. She is the co-author of the two most recent books. So that's my background.
And I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and when I met Steve almost 30 years ago, we both shared an intense interest in true crime and the psychology behind crime. And we started working together and found that not only two heads were better than one, but two genders were better than one, because I could perceive things from a different viewpoint. And then, like, say, if we had a couple of book contracts at the same time, I might have to go to a different place and cover a murder trial and then come back and give my notes to Steve, and we would put together a narrative of a story with the different notes that we both took. And we also had to interview people together, and we found that sometimes it was easier interviewing people as a couple rather than just as one person. It seemed to soften the interview, the subjects, in many instances, and we just had I think we both shared an interest in Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and it's just snowballed into the family business, and now our son Eric is also a writer and has worked with us on several projects as well.
Absolutely. And you guys have done many books, and your website is
it's StephenSingular.com. That's STEPHEN. Singular is SINGULAR.com. All the books are there and the things that we're involved in.
And just how many books have you done so far?
Well, I've written a total of 25 books, and they're not all crime books. About 13 of them involve true crime. And other than the first couple, Joyce has worked with me on all of them, and as I said, is the co-author on the most two recent ones.
Yes, absolutely. And one question I just wanted to ask you before we get started as well is, do you think that, obviously people have a thirst for this type of reading? I mean, I do as well. I find it fascinating, the psychology of it all. But do you think sometimes that we can give an unfair platform to someone like the BTK in a sense? Where does he deserve to have his story told?
It's a very complex question. There's no simple answer. Watch Shakespeare's tragedies. At the end, everybody gets the sword. So, I mean, we've been attracted to this kind of thing for a very long time. Greek tragedies, Shakespeare, right on down. I grew up to put it somewhat personally, so sort of interested in the nature of evil. And that's a long story. I don't need to go into it, but that's kind of why I was drawn to it, to try to understand more about why people do very violent things against their fellow human beings. I was never very interested in the blood and the gore, have tried to avoid much of that, and writing about this, as Joyce said, it's much more the probing of the psychology of it and trying to understand for myself more of the nature of violence. And, hopefully we can, make some progress with this maybe as time goes on as humanity.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it, the nature of violence. Maybe we'll get into that towards the end of this, just to touch back on that just a little bit. But obviously, there's a story to tell here. How did you both, shall I say, get involved in the BTK story?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm from eastern Kansas. I'm from a town that's very small. It was about 900 people when I grew up, which is very similar to the size of the town Dennis Rader, a.k.a. BTK, grew up in. The town was saturated with religion, Christianity, a lot of repression. It wasn't a place you would call very open to arts or artistic sensibilities, that sort of thing. All this is very relevant in the BTK story. So we were out there visiting my parents in late May of 2005, which was 3 months after BTK had been arrested. My son and I went down to play basketball at a gym. My old basketball coach was there, and first thing he said to me is, "You've got to write about the BTK case." And I was a little bit hesitant. I didn't know quite what to say to that. And he said, "No, I'm serious. My son-in-law was on the task force that investigated BTK for a year before his arrest and actually helped to make the arrest, and you've got to talk to him." And he pulled out his phone, dialed the number, handed it to me. And I started talking to this police officer, investigator, and the next day I was in Wichita sitting down with him, and then later sitting down with Dennis Rader's pastor at his church. As some of the listeners may know, Dennis Rader wasn't just a member of the congregation, he was the president of that church. So in speaking to the pastor and what he had been going through and realizing that, his right-hand man, the person he relied on the most in doing his job, was a serial killer. That was pretty startling for him. So I had two great inroads into the story right there from the beginning.
Right. Okay. And of course, I used to live in Kansas, in a place called Eudora, and obviously you're from there, Steve. So in Kansas, is there a sort of let's just talk about the sexual subculture of Kansas at the time when the BTK killer Dennis was growing up as well, because it was quite repressed, wasn't it?
Yeah, Joyce can talk about his childhood. She has accumulated a number of facts on that because that's very relevant to the story.
Yes, Dennis Rader grew up in, as Steve was saying, this small town, and of course Wichita was much smaller back in the 50s and 60s. And on his grandparents' farm, he would watch the chickens being slaughtered, and that began to stimulate him into seeing how small animals could be killed. So he would start killing cats and dogs and birds and take him out to these very remote barns and experiment with strangling them. And he also claimed that his mother spanking him caused some sexual arousal. And then at about age 8 or 9, he got his hands on some of these, what was called like true detective types of magazines. They were kind of sensational magazines back in the 50s and 60s where there would be a woman on the front cover with her eyes in horror and somebody strangling her and the perpetrator being off camera or off in the distance. And he got his hands on those. Those he found very stimulating. In grade school, he would draw sketches of girls being tied up. He would cut out magazine ads of females and would draw imaginary lines and cords around their necks. And he developed a fixation on Annette Funicello, who was a member of the Mickey Mouse Club. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's back in the early 60s. We wanted to kidnap her and had sexual fantasies about that. After high school, he followed in his father's tradition of joining the Air Force, and he went to Japan and claimed that he had, in going to these exotic locales like Okinawa and other places that he visited, that he learned more and more about sex and things that he wanted to start trying, and then ultimately, after he got back, he got very interested in Jack the Ripper. He found it fascinating that Jack the Ripper was never caught. And Jack the Ripper also, in his killing of women, it was very humiliating and mutilated them. And then he also became interested in the Boston Strangler, same type of thing, strangling women, leaving them in very humiliating positions. He studied other serial killers like H.H. Holmes, who was in the late 1800s, Harvey Glatman in the 1950s, Ted Bundy in the 70s. So, like many serial killers, he studied the ones that came before him for his methodology.
Right. And just as an aside, I in my town where I grew up, as I said, very similar in size, I grew up with a boy who killed animals and did some bizarre things sexually. But it became, it was kind of known. And his parents got him there was a very renowned psychiatric clinic still there in Topeka called the Menninger Clinic, one of the first and best in the United States. And they got him in there and got some help, and he turned out okay. I know him as an adult. And Dennis Rader was so secretive. He was so absolutely determined that no one would ever see what he did when he was doing the things that Joyce talked about. As she said, he would do it in a barn or someplace very isolated. So absolutely no one knew who he really was, and this would stay very much the same until he was almost age 60.
Okay, so how old was he when he committed his first murder then?
He was 27 years old, I believe, in 1974, 27 or 28. And so what he did was, it was like he kept trying to do something that would repress all of these things that were in him. So he went into the Army and he thought, well, that'll cure me. And as Joyce said, that he just learned more about sex there. Then he comes back to his small hometown. He decides to get married. He does that. He joins the church. He's a real participant in this small community, and he's doing everything to sort of be normal. But he's not normal, and these impulses would build up. And he had a very elaborate plan for carrying out his crimes. He would start with what he called trolling, which would mean he would just sort of drive around and look for people. He'd seen this one woman whom he had worked with at an earlier job in this manufacturing plant. He was attracted to her. She was from Puerto Rico. And so he started sort of following her around. Then he would call that stalking. Then he would give the whole thing a project name. In this case, he called it Little Mex because she had a daughter sometimes with her, a girl about 9 years old. And then he would name the project as he did, and then he would start to develop a strategy for carrying it out. So this was in 1974 in January, and he thought he was going to go into the house with just the mother and the daughter there, and he would kill them. As it turned out, it was much more complex. The father and a son were home. There was a dog there that was very threatening. Somehow, and it's all laid out in the book, he was managed to get in the house, convince these people to let them tie them up, and then he killed them one by one. All of them were trained in the martial arts. And it's almost like back then serial killing wasn't, people didn't think about it that much, that somebody would actually come into your home and do this. He said, I just need some money and then I'll leave and you'll all be fine. But it didn't turn out that way.
Well, if only they had never agreed to being tied up, it would have been so different, wouldn't it, probably?
If they had fought back. But like Steve said, serial killers this was a new thing back then. People didn't lock their doors. People were very trusting, especially in small towns.
Yeah, this was in Wichita proper, in the middle of the day in a neighborhood. I mean, it's extraordinary that nobody saw anything or reported anything. So once the bodies were found, they sent out bulletins to 500 police departments. They stopped thousands of people on the street in that neighborhood to interview them. And they went all over. They went to Puerto Rico. They went to Panama, where the father had been stationed, and they had no leads at all. So the case would remain unsolved for 31 years.
Was there not any sort of DNA left there as well?
He did, after killing the girl, she was last, and he took her to the basement and basically hung her. He did then masturbate, and he did leave behind a genetic sample, and this becomes a critical part of the story as it unfolds.
So just remind me now, DNA evidence, did that come in its prime in the sort of mid-'80s? It wasn't really there in the '70s, was it?
You could preserve it, and you could preserve it indefinitely, but the study of it is still evolving today. It becomes more and more sophisticated. But he did the same thing at a subsequent crime scene in 1977, 3 years later, and then he did the same thing in 1986 at what I believe was his 8th victim. And so there were 3 separate DNA samples that the police were able to collect and preserve over decades.
Okay, so just going back here a bit, we'll come back into the murders, just going back. So he's got a couple of younger brothers as well?
Yes, he had a couple of younger brothers, and one of them was kind of wild, and he was referred to as the black sheep of the family. And Dennis always thought of himself as the white sheep of the family, the really good one, the responsible one. And that becomes pretty ironic as time goes on.
And of course, the FBI had profiled serial killers back in the mid-'70s, and I don't think from having read the book that he actually fitted any profile that was currently available at the time. Actually, they got it quite wrong.
Well, I think, as Joyce said, he studied everybody prior, or many of them prior, and then he kind of wanted to create essentially his own brand as a serial killer, coming up with a name. I mean, the name is very accurate because he would bind, he would torture, and then he would kill. But he sort of put all that together and then came up with his own way of doing this.
So who came up with the BTK as a sort of, a stamp? Who was that? The law enforcement, or?
Well, what happened was, and this again is a very integral part of the story, is that he killed the Otero family in January of 1974, as I just said. And despite this vast investigation, the police didn't make any headway at all. So in October of that year, about 8-9 months later, a couple of people who were mentally disturbed came forward and said, "Oh, we committed the crime." And that became public on television. And Rader was so outraged by it that he wanted the credit for the crimes. So he wrote this very elaborate letter that went to the newspapers, and he laid out in extreme detail exactly what went on in the house. This body was over there, tied up this way. This body was in the other bedroom. So it was obvious that he was the killer, and he named himself in that letter as BTK. So he branded himself right then.
Well, didn't he have a police scanner as well at some point?
I think, I think he did. Well, I know he did, later on in the story. And he actually was working in city government in his small town much later on. I don't know that he necessarily did back then, but he did later on.
So he wanted the notoriety. He wanted this kind of legacy in a sense.
Absolutely. That was almost as important as the actual killings and keeping of mementos and souvenirs. It was interesting to me that and from a psychological standpoint, that his jobs were kind of menial, compliance officer, security home analyst type of person. That he flew under the radar, so to speak. But in this job of being a killer, he excelled, and he was quite meticulous and very organized and very detail oriented. And he kept these large troves of newspaper clippings, anything that was written about it, all of the souvenirs from their driver's license, jewelry, and he kept them in stashes around his house, hidden under the floorboards in some instances, and also in his offices at work. And it was interesting also to me that his family never suspected anything. But when I read his daughter's book, Carrie Rawson, she wrote a book about him. She said that they were kind of afraid of him. He had displayed these flashes of temper. One time, grabbing the brother by the neck, sort of in a strangling motion for saying something back to him at the dinner table, and so they wouldn't think to go near where his office was in their home. And their home was only like a 900 square foot house, which is rather small. But they knew very well to stay away from his area, his things.
Wow. I mean, just think of, the psychological damage it's not just done to the family victims, but, I mean, his immediate family as well. I mean, having to live with what their father did for the rest of their life. I mean, that's just
Absolutely.
incredible.
The ripple effect, and we've found this in practically all the true crime books, I think all of the true crime books that we've worked on, the ripple effect of not only the killer's victims and their families and their extended families, but their own family. The imprint that it leaves for generations is
right.
It's astounding. It's so tragic.
You have to think about how it would affect your own perceptions, to think that you're living that close to a serial killer and you have no clue, who this person really is. And that's got to be very devastating.
Absolutely, it must be. And one of the things as well is during the crimes, he never actually has sex with the victims. That was always kept sort of faithfulness to his partner as well, which is kind of strange in a sense.
It's very strange because one of the aspects of profiling, once these crimes began to unfold, they brought in the FBI profilers. That was a relatively new thing back then in the 70s, and a lot of other experts, psychiatrists and all of that. And they said, well, he probably, had sex with a number of prostitutes and did some of these, rather violent or odd things with them. There's no record that he ever had sex with anyone else. Now, there's a caveat to that we could get into later. He apparently did have sex in his youth with some men. That part of the story didn't come out until the book was published, after the book was published, and somebody contacted us and told us all about that. But in terms of prostitutes or other women, that's very accurate. We don't think he did.
How old was he when he was having sex with men then?
Well, what happened in that story is that the book came out in April of '06, and I was on Anderson Cooper's 360 on CNN, and Joyce was at home and started getting emails from people who had contact with who they thought was Dennis Rader, because this goes back, 30 years or so.
Some of them were women that had near misses or
Right.
recognized him or said, oh, I met him, but he wanted me to go, here or there, and I never did, or he followed me, and then this man came through.
Right, and what was so unusual about it is that when Rader was arrested, he spoke to the authorities, police and FBI, for 32 straight hours, and he went through all the crimes and all the details, and so you thought, well, we know that story inside and out. And so when the book came out that night, and then this man contacted Joyce, and he said, there's a whole side of this story you don't know anything about, because when I was young, the writer, Dennis used to come down where gay men collected in Wichita, and the two of them had relations, and then they actually went out one night on a date. Rader had the guy dress up as a woman, and when they were becoming intimate, he suddenly changed and tied him up and was very violent with him. And it just, completely turned chaotic and terrified the guy. So he said this was, Rader was extremely conflicted about his sexuality at that time. And so he gave us a lot of insight into Rader that Rader never gave.
And you went and interviewed him in person in Wichita.
Yes, I did. And so he also said that there was a murder in 1969 or 70 that was unsolved in Wichita when Rader was moving in this circle of a gay man who was savagely killed with a knife. And Rader made some remarks about it that indicated to this man that he was the perpetrator. This guy went to the police, but they never solved the crime. So he may have killed more people than he ever confessed to, and he certainly had aspects of his life and his sexuality that he never talked about publicly.
So let me get this right. So you've met Dennis Rader face to face?
No, after I first went out to look into the story in June of 2005, which again was 3 months after the arrest, I wrote him a letter in prison, in jail, and he wrote back rather quickly and said, we may be able to talk further in the future. There are religious aspects of this case that, are very interesting. And then at the bottom, he drew this picture of a frog. And one of his explanations for his behavior was that he was possessed by a demon when he did these crimes. And he named the demon Rex, and he sometimes said that the demon looked like a frog. So it was a very interesting communication, to say the least, and he was always trying to express himself artistically. He was good at drawing. Joyce alluded to some of this earlier, but he was very interested in drawing, photography, writing. Yeah. So I think that rather than coming out in some appropriate way, that creativity tended to come out in the most heinous way possible by drawing pictures of his victims, taking photographs of them, etc.
Taking photographs of himself, dressed up like a victim.
Yes.
Which is what we found when we got the access to the files, the criminal files. We saw pictures, and we couldn't include them in the books. They were just too graphic. But Rader dressed himself up as a woman. He'd put this mask on his face that looked like a woman with a blonde wig, and he would lay in a grave, and he would hang himself from trees, and all bound up. And I mean, he went to great lengths to be creative this way. But what's interesting too is that some of these forays that he had out into the woods to photograph himself, he did when he was leading the Boy Scout troop, which his son was a member of. And he would find ways to leave the Boy Scout camp when they were camping somewhere overnight, and then go off and either photograph himself, or I think in one instance he even committed a murder, didn't he, Steve?
Well, he did it twice, but the most graphic example is that, again, he was this big Cub Scout leader, and he excused himself, and then he went and picked a victim who was in his small town. The first victims, 6, 7, 8 were from Wichita proper, but this woman lived nearby, so he could stalk her more easily. She was also older, and as time went on, as he got older, he wanted to kill older women because that was easier than somebody who was young. So he killed her. He put her in, I believe, her car. He drove her car to the church. He wasn't yet president of the congregation, but he would be. He took her into the basement, covered up all the windows, and photographed her in sadomasochistic postures. So, I mean, this is one of the most, bizarre psychologies probably in the history of crime. All the sex, all the religion, and all the violence is just in this one big pot inside of this guy.
And then to be able to drop her off, in a shallow grave somewhere, and then go back to the Boy Scout camp, and then just pick up in this, to be able to compartmentalize that well was what really fascinated us about this case.
His son didn't even know. His son was sleeping, in the Cub Scout camp at the whole time. So, yeah.
It's just incredible.
It's a case study, for sure.
It really is, and I suppose if people want to study it more, those court files and those pictures and everything else are still available at the courts, I would have thought. You can still dig up the case files on that. Can you?
Yes.
I think so. We were able to use a few of them in the book, but the majority, no, we could. The publishing house, of course, wouldn't let us put those in.
Sure.
There are
too graphic.
There are 2 of the pictures in the book, the least offensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. When you say about the way that he sort of, photographed himself, that I've read this in your book as well, that there was a sort of Well, I'll use your words here, Steve. Extreme violence and cruelty and sexual sadism, basically, in this case.
Yes, again, it was all mixed together. It wasn't just a matter of, going to somebody's place. What he would do is he would break into these women's houses or apartments when he knew they were gone, because he knew their schedules, and he would hide in the closet. He would take their clothes and make a sort of makeshift chair and sit on the chair and wait for them to come home. And then when he would hear them, he would spring out from the closet. I mean, one of the most terrifying things that you can imagine. And it wasn't like he just shot them or something. He would say, well, I just want to tie you up and then maybe take a picture and I'll leave. And so, they would consent to that. Of course, he always had a weapon on him, so they did. I mean, this took time to tie them up, to bind them, to go through a process of torture, and ultimately to kill somebody. So it's about as horrifying of a crime as you can imagine.
Absolutely it is. And I'll use your words again here. There was an interest in a sort of an artistic thing as well. He wanted to be recognized artistically for the killings, which sounds crazy, but that's how it turned out.
Right. Well, that he always needed to make some sort of artistic symbol of his work, so to speak, as Joyce alluded to earlier. This was his real work. And so he took photos of the woman in the church basement. He did drawings of many of his victims. He wanted to write a book about himself, which is one of the things that will ultimately get him caught many years later. And so he always had this artistic fascination. I mean, you would like to think that, if somebody had gotten a hold of him at an early age and maybe helped him in some way, he might have gone in a different direction. But he did everything possible so that couldn't happen.
And then you talked about Rex as well, that this demon or this other part of him, Rex, would come out during the murders. But he could only be himself with Rex and with the victims. His victims got to see this other side of him. No one else did.
Actually, that's a good point, because one of the psychologists interviewed in the book said that Rader really could only show who he really truly was to his victims. They were the only ones where he was allowed to see who he was right before they died. I found that a very interesting comment, because he could not show who he really was to his family, to his coworkers, to his wife. No one except for the victims.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the victims, I mean, yes, there's obviously, older victims here, but even in 86, Vicky, who was 28 at the time, I think the last victim was Dolores. But again, we don't know if all these 10 victims were the only victims. Like you say, there could have been more.
Yes, he said in one of his confessions that he traveled around the state for some of his work, and he said he was constantly trolling. He was constantly stalking. So based upon what we learned from that gay man after the book came out, I don't think we know the entire story, even today.
Would you ever consider re-interviewing him in prison?
Well, I know a number of other people have done it and have gained some access. But, when he confessed, as I said, the day of his arrest, it started, and it went on for 32 straight hours. He wore out one wave of police officers after the next. They had to roll in a new contingent every few hours because he just wouldn't stop talking. And that ended up was about a 100-page document. Joyce was able to get that document, and which was a treasure trove, obviously, for writing the book. So I think we got probably almost the best of him right there, because it was all fresh. It was coming out for the first time. He was very, willing to let it come out spontaneously. So I think it's a very good record of his crimes.
Yeah, and it's incredible. At his first killing, he killed those children as well. I think he suffocated one and hung the other. I mean, it's just bloody awful that he could do that, especially with him having kids.
If you look at the picture, you have to imagine, but he he took the little girl downstairs, as I said, and he hung her from a drain pipe. That is exactly what he was doing to himself in these photos, one of which is in the book. He went into his parents' basement. He, tied himself up like that in women's clothing and a wig and simulated his own death. I mean, you can interpret that psychologically in any way you want, but it's as if, he's either trying to symbolically kill himself or kill the part of himself that he can't come to terms with, or something of that nature. It's extremely provocative to look at.
And you wish that he could be studied by psychiatrists, just to get more of a handle on why he did what he did, and but it doesn't appear like he is being studied in prison.
No,
I don't believe he is.
No, I don't think he is. And I think he's about he's got to be in his mid-70s by now.
That's correct. The arrest would have been 15 years ago, and I believe he was 59, so 74.
Yeah. And he will die in prison. He'll never be released.
No. He traded that confession for life in prison as opposed to the death penalty.
Well, yeah, because leading up to the last couple of murders, there was a gap between when he got caught to the last murder, and there was also talk about that he was going to do a murder prior to just getting caught as well. But let me just add this, but the Kansas death penalty, he knew something about the Kansas death penalty, and actually when he stopped was the right time for him to stop to not be put to death. Is that right, or have I got that wrong?
That's correct. The last known murder was in 1991 of Dolores Davis, whom he killed and then took out into the woods and put a mask on her and then just left her there for the nocturnal predators. And then he stopped because Kansas reinstated the death penalty. He was very aware of these things. He was aware of law enforcement in many different ways.
Well, and because when he was a compliance officer, he just worked down the hall from the police.
Right.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And then you look at his relationship with the pastor as well. The clerk who was the minister for his church, I think it was. No, the Clark.
Yes,
was it Pastor? Let me ask that again. Let me ask that again. Sorry,
Pastor Clark, Michael Clark, had come into that Christ Lutheran Church, I think, just a couple of years earlier. So he got to know Dennis Rader quite well. He didn't know that much about the BTK situation because it went back over decades. But Pastor Clark was a fascinating character in and of himself. And in writing the book, I kind of tried to juxtapose how one man absolutely could not come to grips with himself or his inner life, and it ends up with these tragedies strung all over Wichita, and the other man who had numerous extreme challenges in his life sort of went through the process, confronted himself, and came out serving people. And I think it's a very, interesting comparison of sort of the darkness and the light in people. And I felt that, Dennis Rader had ever taken one step toward, confronting himself and who he actually was in any way, some of these tragedies might not have happened. And the other man did that and came out as a very decent and good person.
So Pastor Clark, he also continued his relationship with Dennis after Dennis was put to a life sentence, I believe.
Yes, he continued visiting him in jail, and he went to the trial too, didn't he, Steve?
Yes, he went. I mean, this was about the most horrific thing that Pastor Clark could imagine. That the president of his congregation has killed all these people. Not only that, he's taken one of the victims into the church, and as I said, posed her dead body in S&M postures. So I mean, it's quite grotesque.
It's a desecration.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a betrayal of the church members and of the pastor.
Yes.
And it wasn't the trial. Actually, he went to his sentencing because there was no trial.
Yeah, and he was there for him. I mean, it was a really courageous thing because, once this came out, I mean, everybody in Wichita hated Dennis Rader as much as possible.
And his wife divorced him immediately.
Yeah, and his family, in some sense, sort of disowned him. but Pastor Clark stood with him, and I thought that again, was an admirable thing given everything that had happened. And not only that, but it sort of sent the pastor on this spiritual journey of his own. Like, if evil is this close to you, if you can be this close to somebody all during the week, especially on Sunday when Dennis really helped him, what do I not understand about human beings or the nature of evil or who people really are? So his journey is also tracked in the book, from trying to understand more about how people can do these things and what it means in the context of religion and spirituality.
That must have been some incredible conversations that you had with him. It just must have been mind-blowing.
Well, it was, because he was this very solid guy before this happened. I know what good and evil is, I know what I believe and about my religion, and this completely threw him off the track.
And didn't you also interview his wife, who was a psychologist?
Yes, his wife was a psychologist who was actually working in one of the places that Rader ended up. So, you have these various interpretations of behavior. There were 3 offered in the book. One is that serial killers or criminals of this nature have so-called bad brains, that their brains are not like the brains of normal people, and that's part of what drives it. Rader came out with the theory himself that, he's possessed by a demon, and the demon was driving him to do this. And the other is the more psychological interpretation that, if you don't, let's say, put it this way, confront your inner demons, very tragic things can happen.
Well, and I liked what one of the psychologists in the book said, Tony Ruark. He said that that Rader's sexual fantasies dominated his life and affected his decision-making, which is the definition of mental illness. When something is just, totally possesses you like that, you can't think of anything else but sexual fantasies and then killing the person. That has to be mental illness, or the bad brain theory. Remember, we interviewed somebody like that too.
And there's a name for what Joyce described, which is called paraphilia, which is interest in sex in all ways. We learned later that he had apparently, had sex with men when he was young. He was constantly taking magazines and cutting out pictures of young girls and women, and he developed, a huge pile of these things that he kept in what he called his mother lode, in this file, this locked file at work. So,
which he named BTK Productions.
Right.
He saw himself as this, kind of a James Bond figure, so this larger than life. He told the detectives in his confession that he wanted to put all of his mother lode of souvenirs and memorabilia and pictures and everything into a safety deposit box, so that someday when he was dead, someone would open it and they would see who he really was. Well, who would probably open that safety deposit box? Somebody in his family. So it said to me that he really didn't care about anybody. He didn't care about his own family. If he could hurt them like that after he was dead, so that they could be surprised by who the man had been all along.
Yeah, it goes back to what I had said a while back, that he really did want attention. Did he want to get caught? Probably not. But in some way, he wanted attention for what he had done.
Well, let's look at this perspective. What were some of the struggles and the pain and the issues that Dennis had, do you think? Did he ever talk about that?
No, that's what is, in a way, very disappointing about it, because, in talking his 32 hours to the police, and then later when he was in court at the end of June in 2005, and the judge let him talk for a couple of hours to sort of get the crimes out in the open, he never took any form of responsibility for any of it. He said, this is what happened, I did this and I did that. But you just, one of his quotes to the police was something like, I'm a good guy, basically. I've just got a couple of bad habits. That was his level of self-examination. And, if you were sitting with him now, 15 years later in prison, maybe you could go a little deeper. But it was just like there was nothing there. It was just a void.
Well, it's basically like saying, okay, I'm possessed by a demon, but it's like saying the devil made me do it. And we've interviewed other people that have killed, including a woman that killed, and she basically said the same thing. The devil made me do it. I was gone, and the devil came in and took over.
It's a way of not confronting anything, which is the whole story of his life. And as I've said, you could say that a demon possessed you maybe if it was a spontaneous act, if there was a crime of passion or something. He would plan these things for weeks and months. I mean, he would put together a whole plan that I laid out earlier. So I don't think he was possessed by a demon for 4 months.
No, and it's taking absolutely no self-responsibility, is it, as well, for what you did, and like you say, especially for the pain that he put everyone through, and not to forget his own family, who, as you've said previously, disowned him straight away. What was the legacy of the victims, the family victims, in the sense when it went to? You said it went to a hearing, not a trial. It didn't go to trial, did it? Went to a hearing.
Sentencing.
Well, I was there when one of these events happened. I wasn't present during that late June 2005 hearing when he made another big confession, but I was there in August when the family members were there and were given a chance to speak. And I mean, you could literally see the pain on their faces. Some of these crimes were 3 decades old. There were members of the Otero family there, and you could just feel this outpouring of pain. This is 31 years later.
Well, Dolores Davis's son.
And then I think his name was Jeff.
Yeah, very outspoken.
And I mean, these things don't go away. The pain doesn't go away. In the case of Jess Davis, and not to be graphic with you, but I mean, he breaks into her house, he kills his mother, and then he takes her out in the woods and leaves her there for animals. I mean, these things do not evaporate over time. The outrage, the suffering. So, I mean, what this guy unleashed was just, unending.
And the interesting thing about reading his daughter, Rader's daughter, whose name is Carrie Rawson, in her book, she lays out what their family was doing while he was killing a particular victim, where they were in their, familyhood, their what they were doing as a family, the other 3 members, while he was out doing that. So it really left an imprint on his daughter, especially. I mean, I'm sure his wife too, but the daughter really took it hard.
It left an imprint on that whole city.
Yeah.
Of 350,000 people. I mean, when the Oteros were killed, there was an immediate spike in people buying guns, people buying security systems. All of those things happened. That's 1974. 30 years later, the Wichita Eagle publishes an article in January of 2004 saying, well, BTK is probably dead, and, he's vanished into the mist. Rader read this, it made him angry, and he decided to bring BTK back and started sending in communications to the police, and that became public, and the same thing happened again. People started buying more guns, more lights, more security. So, I mean, he left an imprint of terror on that city.
He terrorized the community. And in that last, he had told the detectives that when he was going to do his last killing, to prove that he was back, he wanted to pattern it after Silence of the Lambs, what Hannibal Lecter did to one of the security guards by stringing him up, and he had an even, grander finale planned.
There was no sense in all of the confessing of having this kind of an effect on people. His wife, when the hunt for BTK cranked up again in 2004 and 5, he and his wife had watched these news reports about it on television, and she was terrified. She was afraid. She'd talk about it, and he'd say, you don't have anything to worry about. I mean, he just had no empathetic, connective sense to other human beings.
That's what I was going to ask you. Was there any self-awareness during the hearing? I mean, is there now?
No, it was this very perverted, twisted performance, which people compared to delivering an acceptance speech at the Oscars, as bizarre as that sounds. He said, well, I would like to personally thank, the guards at the prison for how they treated me. I'd like to personally thank my lawyers. It was just this self-aggrandizing nonsense.
But then, one interesting thing about when he entered that guilty plea, the Judge Waller, read the 10 counts, and then Rader, of course, began to describe his crimes, and people were kind of wondering why the judge let him go on and ramble on about his crimes and reveal more and more. But what in essence he sort of did, and it probably was, calculated, he created this public purging of Rader. He demystified this urban legend that BTK had become. So the public could now see this monster for who he really was, which was an average-looking, inarticulate, bumbling, balding 60-year-old man, and the mask had fallen off, and it seemed like he did it to help the community heal.
Yeah, I think that's a very good description. It was like once you saw that, you could sort of let go of the terror. The monster has been
revealed. The boogeyman. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think of what all those victims missed out on in their lives, the life that they could have had, and also, Dennis took his own life as well by committing these crimes.
Yeah, and again, to sort of tie it back to what I said about sending in a letter in 1974, once he started communicating with the police in 2004, they went back and forth, and finally he said, if I send you a communication rather than through writing, but on a computer diskette, would you be able to trace anything? And, they wrote back, oh, of course not. We couldn't do that. So he was actually foolish enough to take a diskette from the church and to send it into them with a message. And they got the diskette, and they thought, well, it may take days, months to search this thing and find what we're looking for. It took about 10 minutes, and his name came up, Dennis, president of the congregation, and they had him. They had to get a DNA sample from his daughter surreptitiously in order to confirm. But, again, he laid all the traps for catching himself. And a week or so later, they arrested him.
Wow. Okay. What is what happened to his family, do you think? I mean, did they stay in Kansas, or didn't they left Kansas, or?
His wife just vanished. I think she may have come back to visit, but I know they got rid of the house in Park City where they lived, and I know the daughter lives elsewhere, the son lives elsewhere, and I think she moved as well.
Right. Okay. I mean, living with that, and having to explain what Dad did, that's something that like you say, it's embedded in the family DNA for decades, isn't it? That kind of thing. And what do you think that the Dennis teaches us in a sense? I mean, what's some of the messages that are something positive from all this? Is there anything positive?
Well, the message to me, and again, it goes back to the way I grew up, which again is quite similar to how he grew up. And I grew up, again, as I said, with a boy who had demonstrated some of the same very, troubling behavior early on. Is that you can't escape yourself. You can't escape what you are. You can try, but the repression is going to come out in some way, whether it's sexual repression, psychological repression, emotional, spiritual, whatever it is, you are what you are. I mean, I think that's something we've learned more as time has gone on about, people in our society, in our culture. If you're gay, be gay. Don't try to repress what you are, because it's not a healthy thing to do. Right on down the line, and he gets all of the checklist. He did everything conceivable not to deal with who he actually was inside of himself. And it manifested in a number of tragedies that are still unfolding today.
And do you think that will be his legacy, in a sense?
Well, I think, speaking for myself, that is his legacy. Many people kill for some kind of gain, financial gain, other types of things. Like he killed, to me, clearly and completely because he couldn't repress, himself. It had to come out in some energetic form, and it came out in the worst way possible. So yeah, if you're looking at it as a case study, I mean, as the police say about, school shooters and all that, if you see something, say something. If you notice that someone is very troubled, maybe you can help in some way, talk to them. That sounds like a small thing, but, one person intersecting him when he was 10 years old might have made a difference. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody in his family, his, immediate family, nobody in his later family, nobody anywhere. So.
Well, it's definitely stories like this that make me appreciate the little things sometimes. Do you know what I mean? And I'm pretty much a spiritual person. I believe that the soul continues when we die. I don't think you can destroy the soul. When it comes to the him blaming that there was something evil attached to him. We've all got an evil side, haven't we? In some respects, but we also have a love for our fellow man. And he did not have this.
Well, we're all capable of evil, in the wrong circumstance. I mean, our wars have proven that pretty conclusively. World War II, to start with, that put people in the wrong circumstances, they'll do horrific things. But in this particular case, it was about individual responsibility. And, I think that's what we've learned more about it through our psychological evolution. You have some sort of responsibility to come to grips with yourself, because if you don't, you can have a very negative impact on society. And he is the classic example of that.
Absolutely. And Joyce, what would you say is your message to the audience on this book? What was the sort of, most important message that can come from this book?
I just think that he had a choice. Like Steve said, I think that he could have chosen to ask for help, and he didn't. Whether because he thought he was going to be ostracized by his father or his parents or the community, he chose not to seek help. He was only not very far from the Meininger Clinic in Topeka, a world-renowned psychiatric facility. He could have asked for help. He didn't. And it just shows me that he had no empathy for his fellow man. And we just have to be, there's always going to be aberrations, like there's human aberrations in our society. But the reason that we chose to write about it was not, again, for the gore or sensationalistic value, but to see that human beings are so complex. So you can't even imagine what goes on in the mind of someone else. And it just would make you, I feel for Pastor Clark and for his immediate family that their perception of reality must have been shaken to the core, that they couldn't discern that this person that they were living with in the same 900-foot square house or, helping him serve communion on Sunday was the monster that he was.
People only know what you tell them. You have to come out of yourself to seek help, as Joyce is saying. We don't know who the person next to us is. We really don't. We have to communicate. That's the only tool that we have. And the only person he could say to I'm BTK, is the person he was killing in that instance.
And I really wish that they would study him in prison or after he was dead, or, dissect his brain, I think like what they did with Ted Bundy, and try to find out, are there aberrations in different brains and, that would lead people to, become like this at such an early age. I think it needs to be studied more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And your website, one more time, is?
It's Stephen, Stephen, singular, SINGULAR.com. The book is called Unholy Messenger, The Life and Crimes of the BTK Serial Killer. All the other books that we've worked on are there for people to explore if they want to.
Wonderful. Well, Stephen and Joyce Singular, I just want to thank you so much for coming on today. The links for the book is in the description below, along with the website, and I really appreciate you giving us your time today, and I hope to get you back on in the not too distant future for some more of your books as well. Thank you both.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Thank you.